I'm worried about the yield curve, and I want Powell to say that while in principle these rate hikes are gradual, relative to the global economy and what other central banks are doing, the interest rate path that perhaps we've laid out is too aggressive. And my fear, Michelle, is that the Fed will keep hiking, invert the curve, and we'll be talking recession sometime in roughly the 10 to 22-month band.
Steve, I didn't see all of the testimony. Was Powell asked about the yield curve in particular and whether or not he was worried about inverting it?
Michelle, what could you have possibly been doing other than watching the Fed chair's testimony? You know,
That's what you're for.
Little popcorn, nice soft drink on the side. It goes quite well. But here's the thing. He was asked about it a couple times, said he's not all that focused on the yield curve itself. What he's interested in is the neutral rate or the neutral interest rate. The trouble with that comment, which is fine as far as it goes, is that no senator asked him to follow up and say, okay, what is the market telling you about the neutral rate? So to Joe's comment that he's worried, I think that the chairman may believe he's at or close to that neutral rate, and that could be the signal that the market is telling him from the yield curve. But the yield curve itself, whether or not it goes to zero or even inverts, Powell tried to keep us away from that. And as you know, Joe and Diane, the Fed put out a paper a week or so ago, or a couple weeks ago, that talks about this issue of whether or not the yield curve does do it. And what they're looking at is more shorter end yield curve differentials, really looking at the Fed outlook or the market's outlook for the Fed as an indicator of recession.
So, Diane, give me a bit of a history lesson. I think you see the economy growing rapidly. Give me your thoughts about the second quarter, maybe even 4.5%, 5%. And the question is, when have we last had economic growth at that pace and a yield curve that is so close to inverting, which is typically thought of as a recessionary signal of one sort or another? Or do the two go hand in hand?
Sometimes, but I think the more important issue here is that the Fed actually, there's a division within the Fed. There are those that have now come up and said they are a little bit concerned about the yield curve. They're not dominant, they're the minority. On the other side of it, there's a lot of people within the Fed that argue, listen, you know, the balance sheet was meant to reduce the term premium. It worked, and now we're reducing the balance sheet. So as we do that, this won't be as much of a problem going forward. So they're counting on this sort of smooth transition on the balance sheet to sort of equalize this and not allow that inversion of the yield curve. And I think Jay Powell was very specific about going gradually, also because underlying concerns about inverting the yield curve.
Tyler,
so I'm a little thick here. I want you to explain it in ways that maybe I can understand. Am I hearing you say, Diane, that the Fed's view may be that the position of the yield curve right now is more due to technical factors than to economic factors?
That's what the Fed, most of them believe. Now, there are some within the Fed that don't agree with that, so that's going to be a bit of a division. And one of the people who doesn't agree with it is Raphael Bostic, who does vote. So the next time they raise rates, you could see a dissent from him, which would be very interesting. I think the Fed is really on board for 4 rate hikes.
Tyler,
but you have seen some people
go ahead. Is that you, Joe? Please jump in.
I just want to say, answer your question.
We're going to rename this section "Wonk with Swonk" is what we're going to call it.
So if you look, Tyler, back in October 31st, 2007, we printed 3.9 GDP. It was 80 basis points above consensus. That was after the second quarter was 3.8%. S&P 500 hit its high for the cycle that month, and 2 months later, you know what happened?
I do.
Economy hit its economic peak. The yield curve had been inverted from February '06. Things are going to look really good until all of a sudden they don't.
Yep. But well, that was what I was driving at.
Tyler,
that was what. Go ahead, Steve.
I want to ask Joe. Joe, if you didn't have the yield curve to look at, if that was not something that you were using as a gauge, and you saw the idea that we did, we're going to do 3% or so combined in the first half, maybe a little bit hotter than that. Forecasts for the third quarter are around 3%. You're doing jobs at 200,000. The unemployment rate is 4%. The Fed rate is still low. It's certainly when it comes to a real rate, it's still low. Which part of looking at the economy makes you nervous about a recession?
Well, the yield curve. I mean, you can't. It exists,
No,
so you can't ignore it.
No, Joe.
But you can't do that. No, you can't say.
do that.
You can't create a hypothetical that doesn't exist.
But the yield curve is not the be-all, end-all, knowing indicator.
Then I look at high yield spreads, which have even a longer lead time. I mean, you're going to come back to the same thing.
So fundamentals don't matter.
The capitalist system is built off of a positive slope yield curve. Carry rules the day.
Can I flip this around? On the other side of the question, going beyond the yield curve, what do I worry about going forward? I worry that we're in a boom-bust cycle now. I worry that we're borrowing growth today at the expense of growth tomorrow, and we do have a fiscal cliff in the fourth quarter of 2019 when the fiscal policy, the spending that we have today, comes off. Now, they could extend that, and they could add more spending to the economy and widen deficits and debt, but that has its own price to it. And so without trade wars, which also a full-blown trade war could push us into a recession in 2019. We're not there yet, and we hope to avoid it, as Powell said, artfully dodging that whole issue. I think there is some real issues to think about in terms of what we've set ourselves up for, and the Fed can't deal with that until the policy changes.
Hey there, thanks for checking out CNBC on YouTube. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all of the day's biggest stories. You can also click on any of the videos around me to watch the latest from CNBC. Thanks for watching.